How does your head look to your eyes? Well, I tell you, it looks like what you see out in front of you, because all that you see out in front of you is how you feel inside your head.
The World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity.
But what are the limitations of this definition? Today we'll be discussing how we could redefine health for a more socially just future.
Hi, I'm Claire, and I'm an independent scholar in environmental public health and a geography minor.
And I'm Maya. I'm a joint dance and English and American literatures major here at Middlebury College. Not only are the two of us friends, but we also realize that we have this shared interest in health, broadly speaking.
So, despite coming to this podcast and study from wildly different academic backgrounds, we have kind of found this shared interest in health, and also both in different but similar ways want to pursue health as a career. So those two things combined created this independent study where we're meeting with 5 different faculty members to understand health as a concept and also like the healthcare system from as many angles as possible.
Over the course of this semester, we will be speaking with professors in departments including environmental health, environmental religion, biology, global health, and anthropology. A definition or a bit of information on the prevailing biomedical model for health.
Definitely. So the biomedical model of health would be opposed to like a socio-political model or a biopsychosocial model of health. And there's a lot to it. One is like the reigning champ of healthcare in the US, definitely, and at least most of our like peer countries. So that's important to know. So if you think of healthcare, that's the biomedical model in a really traditional sense. And it defines health as the absence of illness. And it also assumes that illness, which is defined as the symptoms you're feeling, which are not necessarily measurable, so like nausea, headache, stuff like that. It assumes that illness is only caused by disease. Disease is something that's diagnosable. So this also assumes that the body is functioning separately from the mind, so that if you can diagnose something and cure it, your illness and symptoms will go away. Which is a pretty narrow definition, especially when we think of things like mental health or like physical health issues that are seriously caused by psychosocial health issues. And then this also is all under the idea that if you cure a disease, then you are healthy again and you return to a state of health. When in reality, kind of, if we're defining health as a much wider thing, as more of like a way of being or an experience, like an experience is being healthy, curing a particular disease, a diagnosable disease that can be like quantified and kind of viewed from the outside world as good or bad or cured or not cured, is a pretty narrow way of looking at what it means to be healthy and what it means to like feel good in your body and like, yeah.
And one extension of that too is this process of medicalization, right? That certain conditions and behaviors become treated as diagnosable medical issues. So again, a narrow lens with which to look at what makes someone healthy.
Yeah, and a really common example of that would be like race, where we like think of race as a genetic trait or something inherent to the body when really there is no genetics behind race. And that means that racial health disparities, if race isn't a biological like something you can find in the body, then racial health disparities are a product of social and political systems rather than genetics. And to medicalize that misses a lot of where those health problems are coming from.
And recently, though, there has been a branch of research devoted to expanding that understanding of the combination of genetics or heredity and environment. And the idea that health is influenced by a combination of heredity and environment, that's a pretty well-established fact within our medical world. However, the question of how to measure our environment accurately with the greatest number of measurements or risk factors, so to speak, has gained popularity over the last few years. And this was kind of where our conversation around what is called the exposome started with Professor Kate Crawford.
Yeah, so the exposome came to light in 2005. It was created by this guy named Christopher Wilde, who there was all this resources being thrown at sequencing the genome. And Wilde kind of thought, there's a lot more to health and to the human experience than our genetics. And as important and exciting as sequencing the genome is, we're going to sequence the genome. When we do that, we're still going to have a lot left to understand about human health, which is why he created this idea of the exposome. The exposome is the idea that health is influenced by a combination of hereditary and environmental factors. It basically includes exposures from conception all the way through your life until death, and how those interact with each other and how those interact with your genetics. Because there is some truth to, health being influenced by genetics. That's something we know well. There's intergenerational health issues. There's things that you're genetically predisposed to, but there's also plenty of things that you're socially predisposed to. Your health is pretty strongly influenced by education level, income, sexuality, race, but those aren't things that are innate to your being, although they affect it.
So this exposome research is very exciting, but there are certain limitations or questions still around how widely applicable this research or model could be. And one of those is just the question of how to measure so much data, sort of a statistical nightmare.
Yeah, especially when exposures are coming from conception to death. How do you determine that? Because some exposures have such long time frames, it feels almost impossible. Statistically speaking, you're also working with a lot of variables. That's the whole point of the exposome, is that there's billions of variables, a lot of co-use patterns, so exposures happening at the same time, interacting with each other. And if we think about how biological statistics and also how we design science experiments, neither of those things work well with a billion variables. There would have to be a real shift in biology and the health sciences to be able to work with that type of statistical analysis. My understanding, we would literally need to invent new statistical models, which I personally don't want to take on, but I'm sure someone else does.
Yeah, and another question is how the exposome could offer the opportunity for more intersectionality in how we look at health risks. One exciting study that Claire and I looked at with our conversation with Professor Kate Crawford was a study looking at racial inequalities in uterine fibroids. So the basis for the study was the fact that Black women are disproportionately burdened by uterine fibroids. However, many of the driving factors for these inequalities are poorly understood. I'll read a bit from this study here. Most scientists in the field have conceptualized race as a biological factor and have focused on identifying molecular and genetic mechanisms responsible for racial disparities. And then it goes on to say that a recent study concluded that genetic and molecular differences do not explain the increased fibroid burden for Black women. Therefore, there is a need to identify modifiable risk factors of fibroids and specifically examine how intersectional discrimination can become biologically embedded in Black women. So here again, exploring how this multifaceted, more holistic understanding of risk could better equip us to look at these racial inequalities in health. Shifting gears a bit now, we'll discuss our work with Professor Rebecca Gould. Having explored the exposome and a more holistic understanding of health, we turned to a more individual look at what it would mean to recenter racism on the physical body. And one resource we looked at to help us in this exploration was Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, and I'll just share a brief quote from that work. All of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body.
As we think about our potential future roles in healthcare, reading Coates' work was an important reminder of how disconnected our conversations can be around race and health. Coates insisted that addressing racism and health are inseparable.
And in the field of healthcare, this could mean explicitly examining the effects of racism on the individual physical level. Next, it felt important to share some of Claire's exciting summer research because it seems to fit very nicely in this study.
Yeah, so this summer, under the mentorship of Professor Kate Crawford, we studied the impact on the body globally of personal care products. Specifically, especially in the latter half of the summer, I focused on Asia and specifically the impacts and use of skin lightening products. Skin lightening products are a really interesting example of how the kind of social and political systems impact the physical body. So skin lightening products are popular in many countries around the world, but they're particularly popular in Asia. For example, 40% of South Koreans, 43% of Saudi women, over 60% of Jordanians, 40% of Mumbaikars, and 1 in 2 Filipino women routinely use skin lightening products. And it's a big part of the economy too. Over half of all spending in the skincare industry in India, for example, is on skin lightening products. And it's also stratified by gender. Of 3,259 undergraduate students in these 5 countries in Asia, 30% of female students use SLPs, while only 16.7% of male students do. And what's interesting about these products is that the toxicity of them is pretty well documented. Of the 4 most commonly used brands in India, they all contain arsenic, lead, and mercury. Those are chemicals and metals that we know a lot about, and a lot about the negative health outcomes of them. But since these products bring in so much money to these countries, the incentive to regulate these products is extremely low. But it's also important to think about why these products specifically are controlling so much of the skincare industry in Asia. When we think about the imperial legacy of Asia, countries like France, Britain, the Netherlands, the US, having colonized those countries, or just the lasting legacy of racism that they've installed in the political and social systems there, where systems were created where lighter skin tones had more political power, had more economic power. Of course, there's going to be a lasting impact of things like that. And this is a really, really unfortunate but interesting example of how racism is toxic to the body on an individual level.
So, what are the options for how to address these physical or embodied consequences of racism? Well, one developing subfield of psychotherapy and counseling seeks to integrate more awareness of embodied racism. This somatic, or movement therapy as it's called, is typically presented as a way to tap into one's deeply held understanding of one's own body and how it functions in one's day-to-day life. For instance, a somatic exercise might include calling to mind the feeling of entering a work meeting and identifying where in the body you feel tension or ease, and walking through the body sort of systematically. And clearly people of different cultural backgrounds would experience this tension or ease to varying degrees. Specifically, BIPOC people are forced to confront these physical obstacles with a frequency and intensity unknown to white people. One resource we read with Professor Gould, called Oppression in the Body, explains this process. Author Carla Sherrill explains how this discrepancy in life experience between white people and BIPOC people can prohibit socially just caregiving if it's a white mental health professional treating a non-white patient. In other words, it can be problematic, or a problematic use of power, to ask a BIPOC patient to relive their embodied racial trauma. And Cheryl writes that using embodiment or embodiment tools in therapy without understanding that they've been appropriated for the white body can be really quite dangerous. She writes, quote, "The word embodiment regularly appears in somatic counseling and psychotherapy. The term is infused with assumptions of positive outcomes and healing. Until recently, the word has had no somatic affective meaning for me. Indeed, it has brought about the sensation of the desire to narrow my kinesphere, followed by the immediate cognition of the need to look out and to protect my body and spirit. I have believed and continue to believe that the term, as typically employed in dance movement therapy and body psychotherapy, is code for white bodily processes and states." End quote.
So with all of that in mind, the question that comes to me is there room in the biomedical model of healthcare for socially informed care? Or is the biomedical model the problem? Is it completely devoid of socially informed care and space for it?
And with that, how do our attempts at socially conscious care within the biomedical model fall short? And what do these practices assume about the people that they're trying to heal?
It is easy enough to stand still. The difficulty is to walk without touching the ground. Why do you feel so heavy? It isn't just a matter of gravitation and weight. It is that you feel that you are carrying your body around.
Thanks for listening.
And you can find a list of our resources linked in the description box below this podcast.